at the end of this year, and we're really happy to be at this point, and also to have our guest today for this seminar and or webinar. Today, we're going to have a talk from Skyler Wang. Skyler is a visiting sociologist at Meta AI and a PhD candidate in sociology at UC Berkeley. As an economic and cultural sociologist by training, he uses interviews, international fieldwork, and digital ethnographies to investigate whether technologies designed to improve our day-to-day lives meet their moral commitments by honing in on user experience. You would have gotten the full bio earlier. He will be talking about from human to social-centric tech and AI, interdisciplinarity in massively multilingual machine translation. So I think one of the things a lot of you would have noted, especially in the last few talks, has been like, you know, like many speakers on this latter part of the semester on natural language processing. Skyler and I met back in 2019. We were both fellows in Scotland at the Diverse Intelligence Summer Institute, something that I really enjoyed, also because of its multidisciplinary nature of being able to work with different people and really think about intelligence in a very wide way. So yeah, Skyler, I will give it up to you. Thank you everybody for joining us. And yeah, oh, let me actually, oh, okay, cancel. Go ahead.
So, thank you so much, Vikasi, for that wonderful introduction. Hi, everyone. It's lovely to be here. Let me just share my screen. Okay. All right, so everyone can see this okay, right? I assume?
Yep, perfect.
Okay, perfect. So yeah, so again, thanks for having me. It's always, you know, a great pleasure to share sociological perspectives on AI and tech with, you know, a more sort of CS and more statistical sort of crowd, I would say. So I'm going to frame today's talk using the work that I've been doing with Meta AI. I'm assuming that a lot of you probably know that we released a big language model back in July called No Language Left Behind. So that's going to be sort of I guess, the foundation of this talk. I'm going to use that as an example of how we can move from human-centric AI to social-centric AI. And I'm going to talk about the importance of interdisciplinary research within the tech and AI space, which has for a long time been very insular and very much focused exclusively on technical elements. So I'm sure a lot of you are aware that, you know, within tech spaces, most of the workers tend to have technical backgrounds. So they have, you know, master's degree, PhDs in computer science, in math, in computational linguistics. But there's a severe lack of social scientists, ethicists, philosophers, all of whom play a major role in helping make tech and AI more inclusive and more robust. So I'm gonna really spend today sort of laying out the landscape of tech and AI within, you know, big tech spaces. So I want to just make sure that, you know, you understand that what I'm going to be talking about is sort of one very specific and particular perspective, which is, you know, doing research in big tech. You can imagine that processes might look different in other kinds of, you know, organizations or institutions. But I reckon that a lot of the findings, a lot of the things I'll be sharing are generalizable to a lot of different contexts. And then throughout the talk, feel free to, you know, unmute yourself and ask questions. Or, you know, if you want me to clarify anything, feel free to do that as well. Okay. So first of all, I want to acknowledge all of these people. They're, you know, part of the big team of individuals who contributed to the No Language Left Behind project. I will talk more about the projects more specifically later on, but for now, I want to acknowledge, the wide sort of diverse team that I have. People. This is one of those unique teams that were put together very carefully by people who understood the strength of interdisciplinary research. So I was brought on as the first sociologist on the team. I'm still the only one, but we also have linguists. One of the names you see here, Shannon, she is an ethicist. So it was a very concerted effort by the team to bring people with diverse trainings to come together to create, the No Language Left Behind project. And this is, the face behind the paper. So I want to start, first of all, by describing what exactly is human-centered design. I'm sure a lot of you are familiar with this term. This is, something that has really gotten in vogue in the last few years. A lot of AI centers and technologists have started to use this term to describe what they're doing. One of the, when I first got to learn, this concept, of being, design that is human-centered, I was actually very confused. I was kind of flummoxed by why this was, a necessary adjective that adds anything, just because, like, to me, like, technology should always be human-centered. And if it's not human-centered, then what are we trying to do? And then I, dug deeper and started to sort of really read on the historical kind of trajectory of what, there were a few moments in the history of technology and design that sort of brought us to, what we're experiencing today, which is sort of the era of human-centered design. So before, and this was, in the sort of 1960s era, during the Ford and Taylor era, human-centered design was not a thing. The era before human-centered design, we have technology-centered design. So the idea of technology-centered design is that we start with technology, right? So we perceive the human, right, as an operator who is flawed, who is lazy, who basically is just an accessory to technology, right? That's how the previous generation of technologists and designers perceived humans, right? So when you have when you put technology at the front and center of design, right? That's what technology-centered design implies. What that means is that you try and create the best piece of technology, right, that you can imagine, right? And then you basically get the humans, right, to fit into, right, your design concepts, right? So which means humans serve technology, right? Rather than what it is today that, technologies ought to serve humans, right? So it's a very different kind of orientation, right? So again, just sort of quickly, summarize. So technology-centered design, right? You start with the technology, right? You start with conceptualizing. Ooh, hold on one sec. Okay, sorry, for some reason my lights just got turned off. So yeah, so with human-centered design, the design concept is a little bit different, right? With human-centered design, what you want to do is you basically want to say, okay, let's start with humans. Let's identify the problems that, humans face. Let's identify, potential barriers to social interaction, communication, or, the ways in which humans experience the world. And let's see how we can use technology to make their lives better, make social interactions more streamlined, allow humans to communicate with others better, right? And really sort of, the difference between technology-centered and human-centered is that you start with the humans, which means you have to engage in research, projects that really interface very sincerely with humans, right? So that's where, especially in the tech, world, you have these UXR researchers, right? User experience researchers, right? Usually the idea is you get these, user experience researchers to go speak to people, collect data on their experiences. Maybe they bring them to a lab and test certain, kind of ideas, prototypes and whatnot, and try and figure out, okay, like, what is it that humans need? What is it that users need? What are the concerns? What do they prioritize and what do they deprioritize? And use that, right, as the foundation, which then informs the work of research scientists and engineers and whatnot, right? And obviously, that process is iterative, so it keeps, there's a back and forth feedback loop, right? So it's not like you finish this this initial research project, you bring it to the engineers and that's it. So oftentimes engineers, would say, like, mid-development would say, okay, actually we don't have, data on this, so can you go out and collect more data, right? So that's what human-centered design is really all about. So how does human-centered tech become the hottest thing in town? So for many years, people were, to a certain degree, doing human-centered technology and design, but not really calling it that. This concept has become more and more popular, has become more and more in vogue in recent terms, mostly because of tech's reputation problem, also known as the techlash. I'm sure a lot of you are aware of all of the negative press, negative media that big tech companies have gotten over the years. Privacy is a huge thing. Designing products that harm people, that trap people within algorithms, designing products that incentivizes bad behavior in digital spaces, bullying and all that stuff. So there's a lot of, social complaints around what tech has done and what tech has become. So human-centeredness is almost this sort of moral rhetoric that tech has latched onto in recent years to say, look, like, we are doing human-centered, stuff. We're thinking about our users. We're thinking about the needs and concerns of our users when we're developing and evaluating our products. So this is sort of, a lot of it is really sort of this reputation saving mechanism. Not to say that the actual work is not sincere. A lot of this, people who use the rhetoric of human-centeredness are in fact doing very good work. But one of the important sociological sort of facts that needs to be recognized is that the emergence or the proliferation of human-centeredness really came from a response to the negative sort of press and feedback that big tech has been receiving over the last few years. So when technologists say that they're doing human-centered work, what does that really mean? This is a question that I get a lot. I get asked a lot. The paper that was published in July, the No Language Left Behind paper, the subtitle of it is Scaling Human-Centered Machine Translation. So, people who are not familiar with the space oftentimes ask me, what do you mean by human-centered? And when you say you're doing human-centered work, what does it really mean? So in the context of, research in tech, AI development in big tech, when people say they're doing human-centered work, it really just means they use, UXR researchers to engage with the communities that a certain technology is designed to impact. So the kind of work that is being done oftentimes by user experience researchers tend to be very clinical. Clinical in the sense that a lot of it tends to be based on, so for example, you recruit users to come into a lab, right? So a lab is a very clean, very controlled, very mediated environment, right? Where you take away a lot of variables that may be distracting, that may impede on someone's ability to experience the technology in the way that you want it to, right? So lab-based experiments, lab-based tests are very common, right? And then there are interviews. Interviews are a big part of what is considered a human-centered method. And then, sometimes people do surveys as well, and they do focus groups, right? So the human-centeredness, there's a kind of clinicality around this idea, which is that, like, it's very rarely do researchers go out into the wild, into sort of the real social worlds by which people experience this technology. And what you miss then, right, by not doing that kind of work, by doing ethnographic work, is that you miss out on sort of the group dynamics that happen, the constraints people face in the real world, in different institutions, in different contexts. There's a lot of research that shows that, the way people use technologies at home and versus the way people use technology in schools or at work are very different, right? But in the context of a lot of AI and tech development, you don't really get to see a lot of that differences, simply because you're inviting them, again, to a lab, right? Where a lot of the complex social context that people navigate every day is entirely stripped away, right? So that, again, like for UXR researchers, they can really isolate the variables that they're interested in and get a very clear look at what exactly is it that, is working, what exactly isn't working, right? But then when you put these humans into the real world, all of a sudden the constraints and possibilities are amplified, right? But these are things that you're not really catching, right? When you do, when you limit your work to very clinical methods, right? And one of the other big critiques of human-centered work using methods like that is that you start to see humans as atomic, right? So you see them as individuals, right? And you basically ignore the fact that humans exist in groups within complex social systems, right? And social networks, right? You're basically stripping all of those components down to the individual, which is a big limitation, and which is a reason also why, for me, I think human-centeredness is a trope that I hope that people can step away from. And instead, we can go from human-centeredness to social-centric or centeredness. And so what benefits do we gain if we go from human to social-centric tech and AI? So going from human to social, right, requires us to understand that the complex sort of social environment that human beings are embedded in, right? So you have the micro, right, which is individuals, but then you also have the meso level kind of engagements that people have every day, right? So their communities, right, their families, right, their religious groups, right, the different organizations that they're a part of, right? Obviously, these organizations could also include things like schools, interest groups, and whatnot, right? When people are embedded within these groups, the way they interact with technology, the way they engage and interface with technology can be very different, right? One classic example that I give is that, there's a lot of research that shows that the way in which people swipe on dating apps when they're by themselves versus when they're with other people are completely different, right? And then you have the micro, right? So the micro stuff are sort of the bigger socio-political and cultural context, right? So whether or not you are in a war zone, for example, versus you're in a state of just like regular, like peacetime, these conditions greatly mediate and shape the way you experience technologies, right? And then, there's also larger political institutions at work that shape your reality and hence your experience with technology as well. So going from human to social-centric tech and AI requires us to sort of take a more holistic look at how individuals, right, exist, right, in relation to a bigger context, which includes their communities, their families, their friends, their networks, the organizations they're in, as well as the socio-political and cultural context that they're navigating, right? This is not by no means an easy thing to consider. Like, this requires very sincere social scientific approach to understanding the population that you seek to serve, right? So for instance, for my team right now, a big goal of our machine translation project, the one that we're currently working on, is to try and develop machine translation for deaf, hard of hearing, and signing communities, right? So people who do not maybe rely on speech to talk to other people. So if we take a human-centered approach, right, and use a very clinical way, right, to engage with this community, it might mean, again, taking them to a lab setting, right, taking them to a room, taking people from this community, and then maybe doing sort of these one-on-one, interactions or experiments, right? But again, that strips away all of the social context, all of the communal aspects, all of the group dynamics, right, that a lot of people experience when they engage in technologies, right? So one switch, right, from human to social-centric tech and AI means perhaps going into these communities, right, conducting these ethnographic hangouts, right, with these communities, and really observing how is it that they communicate, right? And that if we have a prototype, how would they interface with other people, in the same space, right? Understanding, right, under what conditions, does the technology serve them best, right? In what institutional context, in what cultural context, do culture make a difference, right? So all of these are factors that, a team with solid social scientific expertise should be able to tackle, right? And I strongly believe that would make tech and AI more inclusive, and more sort of able to serve the needs of a lot of underserved people. So now that I have sort of laid out the big kind of, I guess, theoretical or aspirational landscape, I want to go more specifically into, the machine translation project that we've done, and I'll reflect on some of the stuff that we did and what some of the strengths are, and as well as the limitations. So I want to start with, just a brief history of translation. I'm sure most of you, know this very well already. Machine translation first started in the 50s as rule-based. These are sort of, it's almost like translating, from the dictionary, and they're usually bilingual. Words map onto, the target and source words just map onto each other. That's sort of the earliest generation of machine translation. And then came, in the 90s, statistical, which is really all about probability. So you study, high quality translated text, and then you can sort of distill probabilistically what words should be in the model. And then obviously now, in the last 7 to 8 years or so, we have entered the neural network era. And this is sort of the current, zeitgeist that we're navigating. So the goals of the No Language Left Behind project are as follows. So we wanted to double the number of languages offered by machine translation to go beyond 200 by focusing on low resource languages. So low resource languages are, languages that are less digitized, there's less data, digital data on them, less taught, less studied, and they're just, not as resourceful as, languages like German, English, and Chinese. In our paper, we define low resource as any language that has less than 1 million publicly available translation examples. And then the second thing that we wanted to do was to deploy true multilingual translation in a single model. So instead of relying on a bilingual system, which, requires English as an intermediary language. So if you want to do Russian to Japanese, instead of doing Russian to English, English to Japanese, we wanted to preserve a direct translation, a true multilingual translation from Russian to Japanese. And as you can imagine, with 200 languages, what that means is that there are about 40,000 translation directions. We also wanted to ensure not just high quality, but also safe translation. That means, we wanted to make sure that the source translation does not include additional toxicity. So we generated a list of 200 toxic lists. So including close to hundreds or 200 words that we deem to be toxic. So the intention here is to try and get our translations to not include additional toxicity. But if the original text has toxicity, we don't seek to remove that. We just don't want it to exacerbate additional toxicity. And one of the bigger goals that we set out to do is to open source everything. And by open sourcing, we mean open sourcing our data, our model, all of it. And the vision is to allow communities to pick it up themselves, use what we've generated, and build translation technologies for their own communities. Obviously, this is not a perfect solution. I mean, this is one of those things where I think it's an important thing that we've done. But then if you look at who really has access to, open source data and models, it's quite challenging to think about, things like compute capacity. A lot of people who are interested, in using this stuff aren't able to, just simply because they don't have, the resources to tap into such a big, large language model. So there are some, things that we've done to sort of balance out some of the inequalities. So we have computing vouchers that we give. They're like scholarships and grants that labs can apply to gain access to resources that can help with compute. So open sourcing, again, is an important mission, is an important objective. And hopefully for future projects, we continue to brainstorm different ideas that could make access more equitable. So how do we ground our efforts using a socially oriented perspective? So what we did in this project is to really ask ourselves, if we were to talk to people who speak these low resource languages that we're trying to design machine translation technologies for, like, what would these people say? What would these people want, right? What are some of their concerns, right? What are some of their aspirations, right? Do they see having the language being included as part of machine translation as a positive thing, as a thing that maybe preserves their culture, as a motivation for them to use that language more, both digitally and in person. So we wanted to understand a range of experiences that low resource language speakers had. So as you can see in this diagram here, aside from all the wonderful technical stuff that we did, we conducted interview studies with speakers of low resource languages. So we spoke with 44 low resource language speakers. They're predominantly from South Asia and Africa. which are sort of the regions that this, the No Language Left Behind project really tried to focus on. A lot of the predominantly, the low resource languages that we focus on are from South Asia and from Africa. And so we wanted to understand, again, what are, concerns that people have, what are some of, the, some suggestions or recommendations they have, how do they perceive having, machine translation cover the language, potentially changing the education landscape back home? Do they think that it's going to lead to more social mobility back home? Because there is, quite a bit of evidence that suggests that when, a population has access to the internet, has access to good information, and has, access to translation, that has a positive correlation with, social mobility, and sort of, people who are able to tap into, the global knowledge space tend to have, better information, which and tend to have, again, with better information, they can make more informed choices and hopefully, gain access to sort of global knowledge market that could then propel their, individual mobility. And the idea is that hopefully with that, I guess, propellant, as a whole, entire communities could be transformed, and then potentially even, at a city level or a country level, they could, have better kind of economic prospects as a whole. So that's sort of the big picture, kind of like what could language, and what could machine translation do for people. Again, it's very aspirational. A lot of it, again, is rhetoric. How things are, empirically, that really depends on a lot of different factors. Machine translation is not this, cure-all drug. It's one very small solution amongst several solutions to helping people gain access to good information, gain access to, the most of the World Wide Web, right? Which as of today is predominantly written in English. So one of the things that we wanted to really understand from conducting these interviews is, will you start to, use more diverse, web pages to gain information about the world, if we have machine translation offered? Are you willing to maybe write more, share more content in your native language digitally with other people, now that other people could translate your language, right, into English or French or German, right? So a huge sort of implicit agenda of our work is to ensure that first, people feel represented. Second of all, that they can use this to gain access to more information. And then maybe there's even potentially a cultural preservation or language preservation quality to this project. And we spoke with people who edit or contributes to Wikipedia. We wanted to understand if they, might start to write more in their native language, in the low resource native language, and whether that to them is an important thing, right? Because for us, that's a really clear example of bi-directional learning, which is very important. So it's not just that, like, people who speak lower resource languages can all of a sudden gain access to, English information, for example, or English websites, right? We really wanted to disrupt that kind of, unidirectional Western-centric kind of knowledge transfer. To us, what is really important is that people who speak lower resource languages could also, write about their own cultures, and then have, again, the people who speak maybe English, they could now translate, right, that sort of whatever's written in the person's native language, and now they are able to understand and learn something new about a different culture. So we really wanted to emphasize that, bi-directional kind of knowledge transfer as well. So yeah, so we did 44 interviews with low resource language speakers, and we found a lot of very interesting things. We took their concerns really seriously. We defined our ethical values using the interviews that we've conducted, and we used that to sort of like structure our data collection and modeling and everything, and so on and so forth. This is one of the first attempts within the machine translation space to, especially a project of this scope, to really front load a lot of this human-centeredness in the paper. I was told that so I obviously like haven't read all of the machine translation papers out there, but from what I know, a lot of these ethical and social considerations are left at the very end of papers. Usually it's like 1 or 2 paragraphs reflecting on potential ethics and social implications. But if you read the paper, you see that this is basically the second section that followed the introduction, right? So we really wanted to sort of break the mold and do something different, and basically lead by example and say, if we want to really build something that is human-centered and socially grounded, we need to really spotlight, right, the human story, right, the social scientific story, and that's what we did. And the hope there is to encourage other people, other research labs to do the same, to really use human voices and human narratives to ground what is it that they want to do. Okay. I want to quickly just reflect on how social scientific research benefit technical work, because there's a lot of division in a lot of labs. Oftentimes, if they do, I mean, most of the time they don't really have social scientists or ethicists, but if they do, a lot of these people tend to serve as more like consultant-like characters. So, if a research scientist or engineer has a question, they will go to, these research scientists, these social scientists or ethicists and ask, for clarification. So they're not really integrated into the day-to-day work. But in my mind, in the most ideal state, you can really, see that a synthesis of labor, right, could make everyone's work more robust and more inclusive, right? So social scientific research can inform technical workers on how to make their models less biased, how to make their work more privacy oriented, how to think about vulnerable populations more, and ways to design a piece of technology that really is, centered around real human needs, right? Rather than, a very common practice, I think, in technological development is that people go into a boardroom and they start fantasizing a problem, or they make up a social problem, right? And then they go out there, they make up a solution first, right? They want to do something that's cool, that's like sort of technically very impressive, and then they send their UXR research out to look for the social problem, right? So yeah, so in a way they are sort of trying to fabricate a social problem, which then would justify the need for a technology. Yevgeny Morozov calls this technological solutionism. It's the idea that, like, all social problems should have a technical fix, right? So yeah, so overall, I think social scientific research can deeply benefit technical work. The challenge is for technical workers to take social scientists seriously, to take ethicists seriously, and not see them as a barrier to technological development, but rather to see them as an asset. I believe we're seeing these changes happen very quickly. And a lot of labs are hiring a lot of social scientists and ethicists and philosophers. So hopefully this will be a trend that continues in the years to come. And then I just have
about
two more.
5 minutes there. Yeah.
Okay, yeah, I just have two more slides. So when you build something that is social-centric, when you build something that really focuses on humans, I do believe that there is, tremendous promise to the things that you build. I think a lot of communities will take you a bit more seriously. There's been a lot of coverage, even amongst more critical presses who have spoken to scientists and researchers and professors in the field. A lot of the comments that we got were that we're really impressed that they tried to engage with the community, that they tried to elicit the concerns and so on and so forth, and kept it really social centric. This was one of the kind of highlights of the media coverage that we got. And so that's a really great thing, because that would hopefully propel other people who are working on machine translation to similarly take a very human or social centric approach. And then of course you have more critical voices who would say, like, what you've done is not enough. Putting these new languages on, making them available in machine translation makes a lot of these individual, these communities vulnerable to maybe surveillance, to attacks, to privacy attacks, to spam, to internet spam. You make them more legible, basically, and that creates a lot of unique problems for some of these communities. That's one of the critiques that are launched. There's a lot of critiques around ownership, right? It's the idea that, like, oh, like, you're taking language data from these under-resourced language groups, and then you're profiting off of it, even though we open source everything. But the idea is that, like, the ownership question, right, is still a very challenging one that we don't really have answers to. Like, who really owns a language, right? Can someone own a language, right? And, like, how do you limit access, right? Should one limit access? These are all big questions that I would love to talk to you folks during the Q&A. I was actually, right before the session started, I was having a really interesting and productive conversation with Ukasi about this. So we'd love to just talk more about that as well during the Q&A. So last slide. I think some of the key questions, leading into the Q&A, I think that we could reflect on, how can we ensure that communities that will be impacted by technology gets a say in how such technologies are built? How can we ensure ownership is fair and just? How do we ensure that open sourcing does what it truly intends to do, rather than just a symbolic gesture? And how can we take a more proactive approach to ensure that the concerns and needs of underserved populations get addressed in a timely manner, right? So in the event that, there's, some catastrophic impact, due to the release of, these language models, how can we address, their concerns, their issues? Like, is there, an avenue, is there a platform that they can access, right, to get in touch with researchers? So these are some of the bigger sort of, sociological and ethical questions that remain kind of unanswered, I would say. Okay, that is it. So yeah, right. Thank you.
Thanks so much, Skyler, for that. It's yeah, it's a very kind of a good journey through how to be more thoughtful. And I think for like I see some of the people who are in here are working on projects that likely touch on some of these things. But yeah, maybe let's open it up for questions. You can raise your hand on the Zoom, and then we'll then acknowledge you, and then you can ask your question. If there's any questions on within there. I guess I can kick off while we're waiting. If we think about this, like, it's unfortunate we have to ask it in this way, but then if we were then to try and quantify how much money extra it would take for people actually to be much more thoughtful in the way that they do their data collection and curation, like if just in a percentage wise, not in a dollar wise, like how much more do you think would have to happen?
That's a great question. I love that question. I think it's not just money, but it's time, right? I feel like so much of it is perhaps, like, for example, like we speculate a lot on the impact of no language left behind in the last section of the paper, that it could do this, and that, right? But we don't have data to suggest that any of those promises came to fruition unless we collect that data, unless we have a longitudinal research plan, maybe trying to embed ourselves within a community and see how this technology changes their lives in any meaningful way. Like, if we don't do that, there's no real data, right? There's no real evidence. But that's so expensive, right, to do that kind of research. And then, so on the flip side, at the beginning, during the production phase, right, if we were to really engage communities at every step of the way, maybe even setting up sort of a advisory board, for example. So especially with like more vulnerable populations, like I said, we're trying to develop technologies for, hard of hearing and deaf and signing communities, that would, require higher expenses, just hiring people to be on this board, doing ethnographic studies with these people. I would say like easily it could like triple maybe existing budgets. Yeah, and it's expensive. I mean, it's really, as a graduate student, I'm so used to working with a very tight and constrained budget. But the thing about working in tech is that there's a lot more resources, right? So expenditures are a lot bigger. So you can absolutely do this kind of work. You can absolutely encourage and nudge people to do this kind of work, but it's whether or not they see it as valuable. I think that is one of the bigger challenges when it comes to these social and ethical stuff.
Yeah, thanks for that. I wanted to point out, maybe somebody will call out Idris. I don't know if you had any thoughts, given also like what's happening with Afri-Centi and putting together kind of lots of people together to actually do some annotation.
Yeah, so thank you for the wonderful talk. Thank you, Prof, for involving me in here. So yeah, my question in here is, do you have like a kind of, because sometimes with the little data we have, we end up repeating what we have or the same type of data. So people will get funding, but instead of creating or trying to solve a particular problem, we create the same type of problem because we've created the same type of data. Sometimes you take, because for most low resource languages, what we end up doing is either in machine translation per se, translating what you already have instead of creating data from the ground up approach. So do you have a kind of like a guideline or what will I call it, like a pointer, because most people that are doing work on low resource are also like starters in NLP and the rest. So a kind of guide for those type of people, like now, yeah, we have this type of data. So when you are creating data, please don't do this, don't do that. just like go straight to the point, create something like different interest here?
Yeah, great question. Could you just clarify? So you mean, what do you mean by creating data?
Yeah, so in machine translation, what we do, I think recently we've published paper in LREC. So what we end up doing was to get the data is on multimodal machine translation. So what we end up doing was to get the visual genome data in English and translate it to Hausa. So and when you inspect most of the data, you will see is contextually not even important here in Nigeria, because we translate to Hausa and the rest. So instead of us creating a data that will be much more useful to the Hausa community in here, we had to rely on a data that was already created to just do the translation to Hausa, because it's in itself very difficult to get pictures and then create a data of their description and then translate them, because of budgetary and this constraint and the rest. So like some form of what should I call it, like guidelines or advice on researchers that are starting now. So if you are creating data, don't do this or don't do that, like a form of mentoring and the rest on data creation.
Yeah. So yeah, no, that's a really good question. I feel like I can only speak about like generalities, like some big principles, because you probably have way more kind of localized knowledge than I do. But the approach that I believe has served us well and that has been proven to be effective is that if and when possible, to locate and to reach out to organizations or other, I guess, stakeholders who have had prior investments into this area of research or ways of data collection, and tap into sort of existing knowledge that has already been built. So rather than sort of trying to reinvent the wheel, like basically what I'm saying is that someone has probably already thought about this in a more localized way. And it might be a good idea to always start there, rather than trying to come up with something that is like radically new, for example. So I think with regards to the guideline stuff, like, again, like going back to, I'm going to use my example, like we're also at a stage where we're kind of clueless around how to create this data set for, because what we're trying to do is basically understand how we can map out images of sign language, right? Because that's what we're trying to translate. We have no idea how any of this is done and what the conventional practices look like. So what we're trying to do is to actually figure out who's out there, who has done this kind of work, what are the organizations that represent these people, and how we can sort of collect data or use data that has already been collected, and doing it in a way that already aligns with their values and practices. So yeah, so I think it may not be the most satisfactory answer for you, but I feel like reaching out to people who are already stakeholders in this field, right, in that language community, might be a good place to start. Yeah.
Okay, thanks. Are there any other questions before we almost close up? I guess maybe in the spirit then of like, oh, Friedmore, go ahead.
Oh, okay. Thank you very much. And thank you, Skyler, for an interesting talk. Interesting indeed. Just wanted to have an idea. in terms of numbers, how many, you said primarily Asia and Africa. Just want to know the representation of languages in that 200.
Yeah, so
numbers.
yeah, so so we have about 60 something, 67 new languages in this 200 data set. And so those are the ones that I say are sort of predominantly South Asian and African languages. Actually, a lot of them are sort of North African dialects, a lot of Arabic, different Arabic languages. And so yeah, so when I say predominantly South Asian and African languages, I mean the new languages that we've been able to add to the list. So things that languages that Google Translate and Microsoft, they don't offer. But the wide like 200 list contains languages from like all over the world, and it's pretty evenly distributed. But you can actually check out the full list in the paper. Yeah, that's on archives. Yeah.
Thank you. As we wrap up, I think the question I had was if you had that, like, one or two things that you think at the moment could make the biggest impact in people doing projects, what would that be? So obviously we can't change the world overnight, but then there might be small steps that could be taken. So what would be the first step, and what would be the second step that you then suggest to to researchers?
So I think one very common pitfall in AI research is, like I said, to start by thinking what is cool, what is technically challenging, something that you want to overcome, something that is, again, technically sexy or revolutionary. That's where a lot of people start. They go into what I call sort of the sci-fi mentality. They think of all the cool gadgets that they've read, in sci-fi novels and movies and whatever, without really thinking like, okay, what is the real social problem that I'm trying to solve with this thing that I'm trying to build? What is the urgent social issue here? If I don't do this, will people lose access to a language, right? Will people not be able to access information on the World Wide Web, right? I think always start with the real question and then figure out, the solution to that problem. And what that does is that it forces you to confront the communities, right, that suffer from the particular problem. And in order to confront that, then you have to speak to them, you have to engage with them, you have to figure out what these people want, right? Sometimes it's close to home, sometimes it's your own community, sometimes it's people around you, right, and you want to do something for your own people. And I think for me, that is the most important way to start when you're engaging in one of these projects. And I the reason why I emphasize this too is because of, again, the context I'm working with, right, which again is a place where people have a lot of resources, and they don't necessarily start by thinking about social problems. They start by thinking about what they can do technically first. So that's one thing that I encourage. And then I think the second thing is to, work in interdisciplinary settings if possible. I think, events like this is great because I think it sparks different ways of thinking about problems, different, solutions to the same issue that we're all maybe experiencing. So I believe in truly interdisciplinary teams because I've seen the value in that. So if you can, I encourage you to find, people from other fields, find your sociologists, ethicists, anthropologists, whatever, like linguists, and work with them to solve whatever problem you have. I really believe that is the future of science, and that's the future of AI. Yeah.
Okay. All right. I think on that note, thanks so much, Skyler, for your talk. I think some people joined slightly late. Some people have been emailing asking if there will be a recording that it was recorded, and we'll be reaching out to you, Skyler, just for a copy of your slides if you're okay with that. And on that one, and I think I think it's for me, 2023 is going to be very interesting, because I think this is growing. This is not something that's just, for you guys was just one paper. Also for the community, it's not just like, a few papers that are going on there. It is somewhat of a reckoning that's coming for AI of,
totally.
Yeah, it is. It's not just about looking at, hey, can we do it?
Right.
But should we? And or like, what's really the reasening
Exactly.
within these spaces. Yeah, so on that, thanks everybody for joining in. It's 10, Skyler, it's like 1 a.m. on your side. Thank you for really coming in for this side. There's 2 more talks that I left for this year. I think they're both also going to be NLP. This year seems to be a lot of interest. And we'll see you next time. Thank you, Skyler. Thanks, everyone.
Thank you.
All right, bye.
Bye, folks. Bye.